Dexter Voisin. I'm the Dean at the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences at Case Western Reserve University.
Yes, and thank you for joining us. Today we're talking about your book, America the Beautiful and Violent, Black Youth and Neighborhood Trauma in Chicago. And the first question I always begin with is, what brought you to the topic and why did you write the book?
Well, thank you so much for the invitation and for being a guest on your podcast. Well, in terms of full disclosure, I'm a social work clinician, mental health clinician by training, who found my way into doing research, education, teaching, and administration. And, having worked with families and communities over now almost 3 decades, I got really angst by the stories that were being told about these communities when someone was shot on the south side of Chicago, or when there was an accidental shooting and a 3-year-old got killed, or there was gang violence or gun violence. And I realized that the story was really being told from the perspective of law enforcement, but not necessarily from the standpoint of those community members, many of them who I interviewed over the years, many of them who I sat and had conversations with. And it goes back to this old African proverb that says, until the lions have their own historians, the tale of the hunt would always glorify the hunter. So after giving countless of media interviews, some of them that lasted 30 minutes, sometimes longer, and then having the complexity of those interviews reduced to a 1-sentence soundbite that was edited to tell a particular narrative, I felt compelled to really tell the narrative from the perspective of young Black individuals in low-resource communities.
Yeah, and that narrative, I feel that the book does a really good job of telling the story of violence in these cities and these communities. And one of the things that I noticed in your book was that you came across, and I've noticed it too in kind of the reading I've done, is that there are big data gaps in kind of the information we collect. And I think it has to do with how those stories are told, right? But maybe if you could kind of talk about what you found was missing from the story and the data.
Yeah, that's a great question about the data gap. And before I delve into that, I think it's really important. One of the things that really I try to elevate in the book is, what do we really consider violence? Very often we are socialized to think of violence as a forceful act, a gunshot or someone getting a physical punch. And what I really wanted to illuminate in the book, that violence is much broader than this. And violence is really insidious. And, I elevated the terms around loud trauma and silent trauma. And the loud trauma, we all hear it on the news. 4 people killed, mass shootings at a high school, mass shootings at a synagogue or in a supermarket, a young baby killed by a stray bullet, right? Those are the loud forms of violence. And what I really wanted to drive home is that there are more insidious forms of violence that are even more detrimental, that occur right in front of our eyes, that go unnoticed. So when we think of structural violence, like race-related poverty, communities that have been left behind, communities where jobs have left those communities, or there's been a disinvestment in those communities, or communities where you have a high concentration of young Black men extracted from those communities into the prison system. All these are forms of violence that are happening right beneath our noses on an everyday basis. Individuals who don't have the ability, because the American history, as complex as it is told from a skewed example. So folks who don't have an opportunity to see positive representation of themselves in the media or in the history books, or the representation of young Black boys and girls are told from a deficit standpoint in terms of drug users or maids or prostitutes, right? All these are different forms of violence: psychological violence, economic violence, disinvestment in communities. And this propels a lot of the social inequality that happens across the United States. So I wanted to illuminate that. And very often that gap is not really illuminated in many of our research, in many of our conversations. So for example, we talk a lot about the Black educational achievement gap, which situates the problem within the individuals themselves. What we don't talk about is the Black educational funding gap. The fact that many of these communities are racially segregated, that there are lower levels of funding for schools. And that's what's really driving the unequal educational performance. So again, a form of violence that's not even captured as violence. It makes a big difference if we say Black educational achievement gap versus the Black educational funding gap. Right? That poverty and racialized poverty is at the heart of many of these social problems in the United States, which we all suffer the consequences of. Whether or not we are wealthy or not, whether or not we come from these communities, we all bear the burden of that weight. So going back specifically to the gap in terms of research, I think there are many public health scientists who've declared that violence, and when we think about violence, gun violence in particular, is a public health issue, right? And this is the loud trauma, that gun violence is a public health issue. And it's a public health issue because it's related to higher rates of suicide, it's related to higher rates of domestic violence in terms of homicides that are perpetuated by guns. It's related to my research showing that kids who are exposed to higher rates of gun violence in their communities have poorer educational outcomes, that gun violence, high rates of gun violence, or witnessing or hearing about gun violence in neighborhoods are related to higher rates of unplanned teenage pregnancies, right? That all these things can be traced back to gun violence, right? And as we know in the United States, there have been lobbyist groups that have blocked the collection of data to really, prove some of these things that we know from clinical settings, from observational data, as well as what we know from small community-based samples, right? So there's a gap, but it's a gap that, and a story I think that's well articulated, even in the absence of data, in terms of the antecedents, the effects of loud trauma, gun violence in the United States.
Yeah, and I think that you do a really good job of kind of overviewing how gun violence is so just destructive to a community. And I think kind of what I wanted to turn to next, and I do want to get to this idea of Black on Black violence versus white on white violence and how that story is corrupting and corrosive in itself. But I think before we turn to that, I kind of like to explore this idea of the neighborhood trauma that you kind of introduce in the book, and how that kind of factors into what you were just speaking about how performance is lowered and pregnancies up and drug use is a response and things like that. Because you really do create an umbrella that makes you understand these trends as part of this, violence, as you were kind of outlining for us. You can kind of talk about that.
Right, absolutely. And violence in terms of intergenerational transmission of violence, right? So, very often when I'm in the classroom, I show a video, and this is an actual video, you can find it on YouTube, where it shows the socialization of fleas, right? So fleas are put into a glass jar about, that's 18 inches high, and the fleas, the lid is lowered to about 10 inches. And after about 3 days, the fleas hit the lid of the glass jar 10 inches and fall back. So after about a week of the fleas hitting the top of the lid, keep in mind they have a capacity to jump 18 inches, but they only jumping 10 because of structural limitations. They keep falling back down to the bottom of the jar. After a week, the lid is removed. Well, guess what happens? The fleas still jump 10 inches, although they have the capacity to jump 18 inches. So they've been conditioned to realize that if they try harder, they would be penalized, they'll be punished, they fall back down. But what's more interesting is that not only would those fleas jump 10 inches, but when they reproduce, their offsprings would also jump 10 inches. So you have one generation of fleas, underperforming because of social constraints, and their offsprings, although they have the inherent ability, only jump 10 inches. Right? So I use that as a metaphor to talk about how intergeneration perpetuated, right? So Bessel van der Kolk, a famous psychologist, talks about when trauma gets under the skin, that there's something about trauma that actually penetrates in his hypothesis, that actually penetrates our cells, penetrates our body, that this trauma, we don't get rid of it, we continue to replicate it, right? So you can think about communities where individuals have been discouraged, where folks have lost hope. Well, that hopelessness is passed on to their kids. Sat in a barber shop, and the conversation was 3 parents talking, 1 white parent, 1 Asian Indian parent, and 1 African American parent. And the white parent was saying, my kid, they're going to go on to graduate school. It was just a normalizing factor that kids would go on to graduate school. Asian Indian parent was saying, oh, my kid, they're going to go on to medical school, right? There was just this automatic assumption. Black family that was living in poor resource communities, the mother said, I'm so proud of my kid because she's 16 and she's not yet pregnant. Right? So low expectations because society has sort of beaten folks down. There are no viable, schools are underperforming, not helping kids. They're warehousing kids, not educating kids, right? Black fathers are extracted from the home because there are high rates of policing in those communities. In some communities in Chicago, and I would beg to also conclude, maybe some communities, you look at East Cleveland, almost 70% of the Black males have had some sort of interaction with police. And it's just because you have more police interaction, more contact with the police, right? So those folks are yanked out of the homes. You have more single female-headed households. And in America, regardless of ethnicity, growing up in a single female-headed household is a proxy for generational trauma, generational poverty, right? So again, looking at sort of the structure, how it comes to bear on everyday decision-making, whether or not someone tries or not. There's another famous saying that says, if you teach someone to think of themselves as a second-class citizen, you would not have to show them a back door. They will find their own back doors. And invariably, this is what we've done in America. We've taught certain groups to think of themselves through media, through lack of representation, through biased policies, to think of themselves as second-class citizens because we treat them as second-class citizens in the American caste system. And you have a replication of underperforming, only jumping 10 inches when you have the capacity to jump 18, right? So we've created social constraints. We've created schools that have constrained the of kids that have not fostered their growth through disinvestment, through more, having more renters in certain communities where people, obviously those taxes don't go back into the school district. We've created these enclaves of second-class citizenship in America.
Yeah, and a big part of that, I think, is this racialized stereotypes and misrepresentations, right? And so a lot of what you're talking about is kind of systemic, but then there's also this kind of individualized internalization of like the thug, the welfare queen, the black on black violence. Let's get back to that, where, that is seen as a talking point to condemn activism, whereas white on white violence gets a Dateline special, whereas black on black violence gets a headline of gang violence, right? So maybe you could talk a little bit about how trauma is individualized and kind of internalized within these communities.
Absolutely. And it's internalized within communities. But I think, again, we need to go back and pull the lens back and realize that, in the words of James Baldwin, he said that America's story is more beautiful, more varied, more violent than anything anyone has written about it. Right. And he talks about the Negro child growing up in the shadows of the Stars and Stripes. And Bill Clinton talks about the communities that have not yet been touched by America's prosperity. So I think, before we start this conversation, or, when folks enter this conversation around black on black violence, they need to pull the lens back and realize that America has been violent historically for many, many decades towards its black citizens, right? In terms of restricting voting, right? In terms of, when you think about Jim Crow, you think about chattel slavery, right? You think about the Tuskegee experiment. You think about clinical trials on black women, right, without medication, right? That America institutionally has been violent towards its black citizens. That many black Americans, some folks would argue, still have not achieved full citizenship. Look at what's happening with the elimination or the watering down of democracy and the vote, right? So first, we have to acknowledge that there's been a system of violence towards black individuals. Now, what happens to people who are traumatized? They react. Right? So when we think about black on black violence, we have to think about the decades and the ongoing systems of trauma that continue to keep trauma upon trauma and hurt people, hurt other individuals. So very often we have to reframe this narrative around black on black violence to think about black on black trauma. We know that there are really four major responses to trauma. You flee, right? So you try to escape it. You freeze, you become immobile, and you have a lot of people walking around with functional depression in black communities, right? You fawn, you try to appease the trauma threat, or you fight. And this is what's happening. You have a lot of people fighting because they're traumatized, right? And they're arming themselves with guns, illegal guns. Some of these are straw purchases that are coming in from other communities and are being sold in black communities because there's an inherent distrust of police systems to protect, right? I've had a young black boy thing going on in my neighborhood. And I reported to the police. Very often the police criminalize me because they think if I'm reporting gang activity, then I'm part of the gangs, right? So I get criminalized. Or if I report something, it puts myself and my family at risk. And I can't trust that the police would protect me. right? So let's just look at what's happening in the news. There are lots of great policemen out there. My dad was a police officer, but unfortunately, the misbehavior are the ones that really sort of elevate towards media attention, right? So I think we need to think about Black on Black trauma versus Black on Black violence, right? But also look at the system of trauma that continues to re-traumatize Black individuals. Every time I see an example or a story of police misconduct repeated on the evening news, I can't take that in because it's trauma triggering for me, right? And imagine if you see yourself represented in the evening news time and time again, where you see yourself being beaten down, where you see yourself not having safety. It engenders a lot of these feelings, right? We keep, these news items, we keep re-traumatizing individuals.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that reframing is such a powerful statement because it leads away from fear and safety towards empathy and understanding. So if you have Black on Black trauma or America on Black trauma, as you were saying, there's this history that we need to talk about as well. And people often say to me, why are we always talking about this history? Because we have to understand it because of this trauma, right? And it's something that is...
Absolutely.
Right.
And the history is not just historical, right? It's not just something that continues to play out today, right? So, and it continues to be signaled on so many levels. So let's just think about Ketanji Brown Jackson, the first Black woman appointed to the Supreme Court. First in 200 years, right? When that happens, or discussions, we start evoking racial tropes around intelligence, right? We start evoking racial tropes around folks being scary, right? This person has a record of letting criminals into the streets, right? This does not go unnoticed by Black Americans. It's the same racial trope that people have to deal with when they go into the supermarket and they're being followed, right? When folks, regardless of income, are pulled over by the police, and you have to be concerned about your safety, right? So this is not something historical that happened years ago that people are still harping on. It's something that keeps replaying time and time again, right? In addition to all the layers of trauma that have not been addressed. So I think, again, we can think about the canary in the coal mine as a symptom bearer of larger societal ills, or we could blame the canaries for not having super turbo lungs, right, to survive in a toxic environment, right? And this is what's happened. We've scapegoated the most vulnerable individuals in society and say, whoa, why haven't you pulled yourself up by the bootstraps? Well, I have no boots, right? Why is it that, in Cleveland, 70% of the infant mortality deaths among Black women, regardless of education and class? There's nothing inherently wrong with Black women. Race is a social construct, right? Racism and structural racism is a problem. So I think it's a subtle nuance, but we have to be mindful that language is powerful and words are powerful, and how we frame this problem so that we don't repeat a colonial narrative and anti-Black racist narrative around communities that have been disenfranchised and that have been commercialized.
Right. And just the level of exhaustion that on top of the trauma that happens every time those narratives are brought back up. It's, as a white person, I hear that and go, oh, that train's never late, but it's also distanced from me. So I don't have the same immediate response to it. But the empathy of understanding there's a huge part of the population that's getting triggered in a different way, or, reacting in a different way. Triggering is maybe too strong a word, but, this kind of... Right.
Yeah, and the privilege of having privilege is that you don't have to think about these things, right? And it's the same thing in terms of even my male privilege. I'm talking to a colleague of mine, and I'm telling her, this is a good friend of mine I was having a conversation with years ago. And I said, oh, I came in, it was 2:00 in the morning. And she's like, 2:00 in the morning? And she's having all these reactions and she's getting triggered. And I'm like, what's going on with you? Mm-hmm. And she's like, I'll never stay out until 2:00 in the morning. And then I realized, male privilege. Mm-hmm. I can walk the streets and not have to be as concerned about physical vulnerability and safety, whereas a woman has to navigate, in some cases, decide how they're going to get home, kind of plan safety because of physical vulnerability. As a male, I have a certain privilege that I don't have to be aware of. And that goes for any privileged group. Mm-hmm. You don't have to think about it, right? But, again, mothers teaching their kids or young people leaving the home, and when they leave their house, they have to think, how do I present my Blackness so that I am not a threat to police officers? Mm-hmm. I'm not a threat to someone in the elevator, right? How do I have to make people feel comfortable around me because my skin color has become weaponized?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so important. One of the things that I think we can probably talk about this for many days, but one of the things that does a really good job about doing is kind of giving us a chapter of hope at the end and kind of investigating mm-hmm. some of the interventions and disruptions and activism that is kind of happening in regards to this trauma, in regards to this neighborhood violence. And maybe you could just pick one of your favorites and kind of tell us a little bit about that and how it's how you see it as changing what we're talking about.
Yeah, so in chapter 9, I talk about rebuilding the village, rebuilding the broken pieces. And I specifically wanted to end the book in terms of talking about community interventions, university community partnerships that are really focused on rebuilding the fabric of communities, right? And again, if we look at like East Cleveland, or we look at certain parts, these communities were not always under-resourced. They didn't start like this, right? There's a whole historical trend, jobs leaving, white flight, and so on. And I talk about that in chapter 4. And although I reference a Chicago community, it's basically any low-resource community across the United States that has a similar story. One of my favorite interventions is Mothers Against Senseless Killing, MASK. And it's a simple community-based intervention where mothers, in some of the more high crime neighborhoods, they dress in pink T-shirts with the logo on there with sandwiches, and they just hang out on the street corner in the summertime. And when they see young people who should be in school, who are not in school, or they see young people just sort of milling around, they engage them in conversation. Again, it goes back to what you say, humanizing individuals, seeing empathy. And what they're actually engaging in is sort of like collective mothering, collective parenting in communities, right? And many of us from our generation, we grow up and we talk about if you did something wrong, individuals within your neighborhood would correct you, but they'd also tell your parents and you'll get a second level of correcting, right? And that seems to transcend across ethnic lines, a certain sort of generational neighborhood parenting. So they've done that, and they've collected data, and they found that on those blocks where you have those mother figures, that they reduce violent crime by over 70%. Yeah, and again, it's helping kids to see themselves as kids, seeing them as kids, not as thugs, helping them to recast a different narrative. seeing them as young people in need. And all the sociological studies, they put a fancy term on that, and they talk about collective efficacy or community efficacy, right? And it's the ability of communities to come together to monitor what's happening in a social space, and then, help with more pro-social behaviors. So simple interventions like that have been demonstrated to be very effective. And I talk about a lot more interventions, folks doing yoga in streets in terms of helping the young people self-regulate the whole issue of trauma and anxiety, right? Helping to recognize, put a name to it. Basically, they're telling young people, you are not crazy, you are not bad, you're living in bad circumstances and a crazy environment, right? So they're acknowledging, right, the toxicity of what these individuals are dealing with, which is the first step towards healing.
Yeah, and I think that's a great place to leave it. And I think that your book does a really good job of kind of giving us that whole arc from beginning to end, and really the ending was very powerful to me. So I want to thank you for your time, but do you have anything you would like to leave us with as we go about our day now?
Well, Nelson Mandela said that poverty is a man-made issue, and it can be cured by man-made solutions. And many of these issues, they have been created by human action, and they can be fixed by human action. It's not easy, but many of these things are fixable. And I just want to thank you again for all the incredible work that you do to create a platform for these conversations and bring complexity to many of these issues that very often get oversimplified. So thank you for all that you do.
Well, thank you for your time.